everyone, it's Becky Hall from Champion Briefs here to do a topic analysis video on the March 2016 resolution resolved the United States should withdraw its military presence from Okinawa. Similar to the other videos I've done, we're going to talk about some argumentation as well as some history and the events I think that are really important for you to understand headed into the round. However, unlike the other videos, I'm actually going to spend quite a bit of time talking about some arguments that could be made on the resolution. When you first look at it and as you start doing research, it appears that the number of arguments is very limited and there's not really a lot of diversification that you can do. But I want to talk to you about some different ways you can take the arguments so you make that easy distinction around for separate and distinct points. So let's get started. So when World War II ended in 1945, the international community and the United States were basically like, Japan should no longer have a military, like, you're not allowed to have that. And so, for obvious reasons, Japan complied, and so their military abilities, their ability to even have a military, ended in 1945 when they surrendered, and starting in 1947 is when that, like, legally went away. So, in 1947, there was a formal decommissioning of the Navy and the Army, and there was a new constitution written in 1947 in Japan. And this created this legal precedent for Japan in that they weren't allowed to have an active military of their own. So, since then, there's been a little bit of changes, but for the most part, like, they are not allowed to have an active military. Alright, so then there was this time period between 1947 and 1951 where basically the United States volunteered to step forward and help Japan with the transition from the regime during World War II to one under a new constitution that obliged and followed international laws regarding their ability to have any type of military. So their U.S. presence in Japan really started between 1947 and 1951. So when you are in the round debating about negative effects on whether it's on the environment or maybe how much the people don't like U.S. presence, just keep in mind that we've been there since 1947. And this is after we bombed them with a nuclear weapon. So, like, obviously there is like a very complicated and long history in Japan and for the Japanese locals as to why they dislike U.S. presence. So keep that in mind. In 1951, we had the Treaty of San Francisco, which is between Allied powers and Japan, which basically meant all of the Western nations that tried to help end World War II and Japan. And what this did is it basically formally stated to the international community that Japan had created, implemented, and could now enforce properly their new constitution. And there were a lot of other, like, political changes that happened in the new constitution, but the one you really only need to know about is the fact they can't have a military. So then we established what we call the U.S. Forces Japan, which is abbreviated as USFC. And what this was is it's a formal U.S. presence in Okinawa, Japan, which is an island, and basically, like, we are kind of the peacekeepers, but it created this legal precedent in this treaty that the U.S. would come to aid Japan if it was ever threatened by any type of regional or international actor. So that's when it was really established in 1951, and we had that formal establishment of true presence in the country. In return, Japan actually promised us natural resources, so they were like, if you come in and protect us, you can have some of our land for your base, and, like, we're not going to charge you rent and stuff like that. So that agreement happened in 51, so keep that in mind also as you go into the round. 1959 was when the first, like, really large documented opposition to U.S. presence started to, like, be reported to the rest of the world, and they were protesting things like high crime rates, so you had a lot of public intoxication, drunk driving, there were some, like, minor petty crimes like looting, and there was, like, environmental degradation for the bases, and, like, the Americans were kind of being disrespectful, and, like, cultural clashes. So that all happened in 1959. So the tension is already building. So in response to that, in 1960, the United States created this Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security. You could either see it as a really intelligent PR move or a really slick move by the United States to kind of, like, get Japan to calm down. So this treaty created what's called the status of extraterritoriality. It's really hard to say. It's quite the tongue twister. But basically what that establishes is that if a U.S. troop member commits a crime in Japan, they are not held legally responsible under the Japanese judicial system. They're actually held responsible under the U.S. military judicial system, not the nation that they committed the crime in. So you could see this as either a really smart PR move from the United States to basically tell the Japanese people that if a service member commits a crime, that they will absolutely be tried in U.S. military courts. So alongside that, you have what the United States thought could be like a greater deterrent for military members committing crimes, and like there will, like 90% of the time, they're going to have some type of punishment, versus like if you stick them in the Japanese judicial system, like I don't really think there would be like a lot of legal repercussions for those individuals. And there would be like a giant PR disaster between Japan and the United States if like they started imprisoning our troops for like petty crimes or whatever. So the United States wanted to prevent that entire PR disaster. So they created this treaty, and they were thinking maybe it would deter some troops from committing these crimes. And you could argue that it did have that effect, and you can also argue that it hasn't, based on like the current protests that are happening in Okinawa and the reasoning behind those individuals wanting U.S. troops out. So you could see it either way. In 1996, there was a lot of discussion about moving the U.S. base in Okinawa, on the island of Okinawa, up north to like a less populated area. Apparently when they originally built it, they built it like in a more populated region, which is towards the middle or southern part of the island, which is where most of the people live. So they were like, maybe we could just solve these issues by like moving the base farther north, but that never went through. So no response from the Japanese or U.S. government in terms of like it actually happening. A couple years ago, Shinzo Abe, who is the Prime Minister of Japan, it's Abe, not Abe, just so you know, you should know how to pronounce it. Abe has basically been trying to win political support by saying he's going to kick the U.S. troops off. So there's been this whole mess for like the past 10 years, and discussions about like, oh, should we like move troops off, you know, to move troops off to Guam, move troops off to the Philippines, like where can we transition these parties, or this military presence that's away from Okinawa. So he was trying to win political support. So there's actually going to be like 5,000 Marines that are moved to Guam in like 2019, and that agreement was reached in 2013, but that's really the only discussion that's actually resulted in some type of policy action between Japan and the United States. In the recent years, you've seen a lot of protests. Like, if you just Google U.S. troop presence in Okinawa, like the top 10 or 12 articles that are going to come up on Google are about like how much the local Okinawans want the U.S. military out of, or off of their island and out of their town. And it'll discuss a lot of issues that they have. And I think a lot of it roots in cultural differences, but there's definitely a lot of discussion about like maybe the troops aren't treating the environment correctly, and like maybe they're like higher rates of drunk driving or like petty crimes. So there's a lot, and you can read up on it as to why the Okinawans want the U.S. troops off. But at the end of the day, like I think those arguments may not be the most persuasive in around to say that the general public wants something, because they also change their mind all the time, and the general public isn't making policy decisions that have effects on like international relations and global security. So you could use that argument, but I don't know if it's the most persuasive. Another thing that we should discuss before I start talking about argument specifics is the less than 1% of the population of Japan is actually on Okinawa, and it houses over 75% of the U.S. military presence in Japan itself. So there is a huge concentration of U.S. troops. I think the number I read was like 36,000 troops in Okinawa in 2012, and that was the most recent number. So there are obviously troops in other places in Japan, but most of them are on that island, so just keep that in mind. Alright, so let's talk about some argument specifics. I really think that there are basically four main arguments that you can make in a round, whether you're on the pro or the con side. The first I want to talk about is this concept of like U.S. hegemony, or it's sometimes abbreviated as U.S. hedge, H-E-G. And basically this idea is like, is the U.S. the biggest power and the biggest player when it comes to like our army or our military size, or like our ability to affect diplomatic issues. So this concept of hegemony is like, how powerful is the United States, and is our power projection, like, can we actually make change with that? So if we have low U.S. hegemony, the idea is that we don't have a very strong military, or it's weaker than other militaries, and that we don't have enough diplomatic sway to like affect talks over a sensitive issue. If we have high U.S. hegemony, which like you could argue that happened after World War II, when we kind of took over Japan during that 47 through 51 period, right? Like we had huge sway on decisions made in the international community, and we could deter aggressive actors just with our military presence. So this concept of like, is the United States essentially like in charge of the world, or are they not quite in charge? Are there other powers in play? I think it is a really big argument, and it was a really big argument at the rounds that I saw this weekend at a tournament I was at. So there are a lot of different authors who will say, right, like U.S. presence in Okinawa is really critical to U.S. hegemony, right? Like we can balance the region, we can create a deterrence. And so this concept of hegemony is really the overarching umbrella to a lot of individual arguments that are going to be made. So you need to understand what hegemony is, whether the United States has high or low hegemony. You can argue it either way. And you also need to know, like, how does U.S. presence in Okinawa affect hegemony? And then the fourth thing you need to know is, like, why is hegemony important? You can find all of those arguments pretty easily online. There are arguments made in Policyland all of the time. So if you have policy kids on your team, you might be able to like ask them to sit down and discuss hegemony with you, because policy kids generally have a really good understanding of it. But you can also get it too if you're like looking up articles and trying to see, what is our military and diplomatic standing in the international community. So a lot of the arguments in the brief talk about how the U.S. presence is really helpful towards hegemony, and some of it talks about how like it's not helpful, or it would be more helpful if we were somewhere else. So the two really big overarching arguments that fit under like this umbrella of hegemony is this concept of balance and deterrence. So a lot of the literature, and the reason why we were in Japan starting in 1947 is so that we could balance out the region and kind of like deter aggressive actors. So the balancing arguments really have a lot to do with, who are the big players in Eastern Asia. You've got India, China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and the United States, because like Japan and the United States like kind of go together. So you really have 5 big actors, right? And so the concept is that the idea is that if the United States is there, it can kind of deter those other aggressive actors that we don't want making really bold moves. So that would be places like China and North Korea mostly. We're on really good standing with India for the most part, so like most of the literature does not discuss how India would be affected, and most of it's focused on China and North Korea. So the idea is that if we are in Eastern Asia, in that region specifically, and a lot of the literature is like, no, the geographical location of Japan is really key to having a fast response time and to like making our presence really well known in Eastern Asia in order to balance these other large actors. So the evidence is pretty specific as to the geographical location of Okinawa. On the flip side, we have the 7th Fleet in the Eastern Asian Ocean. We have like troop presence in South Korea, right? Like we have bases all over, and probably a lot more places that are not published. And we have troops in Guam. So we would still have that fast response time, and you could argue like faster with a naval fleet versus like stationed Marines on an island. So you could say, yes, it's maybe important, and you also can argue effectively that it's not. and we talked a little bit about this, but the idea of deterrence. So the United States, when we went in 47, we're supposed to be essentially deterring Japan or any other aggressive actor from like going crazy, right? And so that's kind of worked a little bit and like kind of also not worked very well. So you can argue, right, North Korea probably has not developed a nuclear weapon because of a lot of international efforts to ensure that doesn't happen. And one of those efforts you can claim is that U.S. presence, like we have Patriot missile systems, like we have troop presence, like we have machine capabilities there that can shoot down or like disable North Korea's ability to like launch attacks on other regions, right? The argument you can also make is that we deter China from acting really aggressively. There's this conflict over the Senkaku Islands, which is in that area. China also, there's like this dispute between China whether or not they like own Taiwan, and Taiwan is like, nah, we're independent and like you don't really own us, and so or like you're not really in charge of us. And so there's a lot of discussion about like how could U.S. troop presence like kind of balance or deter China from acting aggressively towards Taiwan. So basically all of these things like we don't want to happen in Eastern Asia that would like create catastrophic geopolitical and economic like would create all of these issues, right? Like we can probably balance some of that. On the flip side to deterring North Korea and China, like you could say there's a lot of discussion about how like China's not going to do anything stupid. They're like the biggest economic player in the world, so they're not just going to go around taking over land from everybody else because that might not be so great on our trade relations. And China has a very vested interest in ensuring trade routes in Eastern Asian Ocean, or like in the Eastern Asian Ocean, is secured, like because otherwise they can't export their goods, which the whole world purchases from them. So they also have a vested interest in making sure everything is running smoothly. You can also say that like it hasn't really been effective because like North Korea launched a hydrogen bomb or detonated a hydrogen bomb supposedly like a few weeks ago. So there's all of this you can debate back and forth, and what you need to make sure you're really doing is the evidence has to have specific warrants as to why uniquely Okinawan presence is really important. And it's hard to find, but it definitely exists out there. A lot of it's in the brief too, so I definitely encourage you to look in there because we spent a lot of time ensuring that those warrants were included. Another argument that's kind of separate from hegemony, but like you could argue kind of falls under it, is the United States' ability to respond to humanitarian issues, so like typhoons or like other natural disasters. There's a lot of lit out there that says that U.S. presence in Okinawa ensures fast response time to humanitarian efforts, or like humanitarian events that need assistance. And it's really important, and we've helped in like 12 major events in the past like 10 or 12 years. And so I think that's a very persuasive argument, but you can also say like, yeah, we can still do that with our troop presence in South Korea or with our naval fleet, right? There's nothing unique to being stationed in Japan. Another thing you can argue is that Japan really wants to, and they have troops essentially that can like aid in defense and also act in humanitarian efforts, so you can also bring that up. Japan also does that. And so also, almost every developing nation comes to the aid when there's like a huge humanitarian disaster, so you don't necessarily need U.S. troop presence on an island in Japan to do that. Another argument that I think is pretty important to understand is this concept of like whether or not Japan militarizing is good or bad. So that is also going to kind of fall under whether or not like there needs to be a deterrent in Eastern Asia, and whether or not like Japan militarizing would hurt that balance in Eastern Asia. So right now there's a lot of debate that if Japan rewrote their constitution, right, like they could rewrite the fact that they could have a military capability and could have like offensive military capabilities. And so if that were to happen, right, like you can talk about how that's really bad for Eastern Asia, or how that like might be better for the region rather than having U.S. troop presence there. So there's a lot of literature that discusses either way. Once again, it's included in the brief, and I think these are arguments that you should definitely explore. The last argument I will discuss, and this is more of an argument that you should not be making at all, that I really want you guys to listen to and think pretty hard about. So there is a lot of discussion about how U.S. troops are like creating or like committing a bunch of crimes in Japan, and specifically, right, like there are a lot of highly publicized cases of U.S. troops either raping or sexually abusing some Japanese women or men, right? Most of it's women that's published, but it also happens to men. You should not be making arguments about this for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's definitely non-unique to military presence, right? It's a terrible thing. Like, it is awful and like a terrible thing that happens, but when you have large groups of international actors in one area, right, like that unfortunately happens a lot more than we would like to think. If you go back to look at like UN presence in Haiti after the earthquake, right, there were a lot of issues with sexual assaults being reported and allegations of that occurring. When you had UN peacekeepers in Sudan and South Sudan and also Somalia, right, that happened too. It happens really anywhere there's a large international a large concentration of international actors or outside actors in a country. So one, it's non-unique. Two, you can be making way better arguments rather than exploiting like the emotional or pathos impact that goes along with this. Three, I think it's really exclusionary. If you are debating against someone, or your judge is someone who has experienced it or knows someone who has experienced sexual assault in any type of form, right, like sitting through a debate where you're discussing the emotional implications and using that as a tool to like persuade someone as to like why we should not have troop presence in Okinawa, that's pretty traumatic, and you should not be doing that. Also, there are just way better arguments you can be making. So when it comes down to it, I think you can discuss crimes and issues that occur, but I think you should just keep them in like this nebulous rhetorical phrasing, right? Like they commit crimes, the Okinawans want them out, but don't talk about specifics and don't emotionalize the impact of such a terrible thing that happens. If you do hit a team that says that, I hope that those 2 or 3 responses are helpful for you, and it's easier for you to answer that way, but do not run those. You should not be doing that. There are much better arguments to run, so you should do those instead. Well, I hope that you guys found this helpful. We discussed history that is particularly important to know as you head into a round, some different arguments you can be using, one argument in particular you should avoid and reasons why, and some general strategies in the round. So this has been Becky Hall from Champion Briefs, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video TA and found it helpful. I would really encourage you guys to check out the brief. There's a lot more in-depth analysis, and as well as cards, obviously, that have links to evidence that you can use in your round. So, good luck!